Hello. The name of today's training is Addressing Challenging Behaviors. And the target audience for today is for staff in school based learning centers, as well as staff in the Autism Resource Services program. So, to visit our objectives for today, it is important to note that not every behavior or situation that we will face is going to be addressed. However, this presentation will give participants guidance and a way to think about addressing challenging behavior. So let's talk about our first objective: to learn how to approach behavioral challenges from an updated perspective. We need to think about how we approach behaviors and rewire our brain when it comes to behavior. We need to approach all students like they are new to classrooms, regardless of age or history in the classroom. And we also are going to review proactive and responsive strategies to common behavioral problems while maintaining safety and distance for students and staff. We need to develop happy and engaged learners. We will talk about how we will establish happy and engaged learners throughout this presentation. Understanding this content is crucial to mitigate and reduce problem behaviors from the get-go.
We're going to start by changing our expectations. We're going to have to adjust our expectations for the current reality. Our priority is health and safety. Therefore, we may need to adjust some of the strategies to ensure students are safe. Initially, you may not be able to perform and teach at 100%, and that's okay. Preventative strategies and skill building interventions are going to be essential during this time. Remember, the goal is to be able to get to 100% eventually, but at start, there will be a lot of other variables to attend to, such as health and safety, social distancing, setting up consistent routines, classroom setup, and adhering to the health protocols. We will need to be flexible in our expectations. This could be cyclical, depending on your students, their attendance, participation, and behavior.
Rewiring our brains. We need to consider that relatively strong behavioral strategy in a normal world may not be appropriate during COVID, as it could cause an increase in problem behaviors. For example, he's going to complete the entire task because the directions say to complete problems 1 through 10. Students have been out of school for almost a year. This is not the time to do this, as we know that this will increase problem behaviors, which will then make it necessary for close proximity. We may need to accept that the student only completed a few problems. Remember, the goal in the moment of the behavior should be safety, even if that isn't compatible with your long-term goals for that student. For example, if you were using a token system or behavior contract and had been able to remove that system in anticipation of a transition, it is okay to bring that token system back. Remember, our goal is safety. Now we're going to look at a resource about de-escalation tips in light of the coronavirus anxiety. And this actually comes from the Crisis Prevention Institute. And so it is just very important to remember these tips for de-escalation. Tip 1 says, understand that behavior is communication. Tip 2, avoid the power struggle. Tip 3, use limit setting. Tip 4, practice rational detachment. Tip 5, develop rapport. It's important to develop rapport and relationships with your students, especially as we re-enter school.
Selecting behaviors to target. Behaviors will not be able to address as we typically would. Behaviors such as physical prompting, The behavior protocols may elicit an increase in behaviors and may not be able to be addressed even if it is on the student's IEP. We're going to have to consider redirecting, prompting, and ignoring whenever possible for minor or low level behaviors. We're going to have to rethink how we address these behaviors during COVID. Teachers and paraeducators know their students and can anticipate certain behaviors before returning to the building and target them by rethinking how to address them. For example, for some students who engage in self-stim behaviors, including vocalizations or rigidity or OCD behaviors, some students may need to be able to finish the routine before moving on. We may have to let them. Standing at a desk instead of sitting, walking during PE or recess instead of engaging in the original task or expectation might be okay for now. Wearing shoes, we may have to let them take them off and leave them at the door and make it a non issue.
As we prepare to go back to school, it might be important to consider some proactive strategies to avoid problem behaviors. Some proactive strategies we could engage in: frequent opportunity for movement, going outdoors if it is safe and we are able to do so. Consider flexible seating options within your classroom, such as a ball chair, a wobble cushion, a standing desk, TheraBands, etc. And proximity can still be useful even if we are not directly next to a student. Positioning teachers near classroom doors and planning strategically for hallway transitions. With all of these strategies, it's important to be mindful of shared materials and try to limit the use of materials that cannot be sanitized. We may need to think about our students who have anticipated behaviors and think if we're going to need additional equipment to prepare for that student. Think about using the existing supports or resources in your building, maybe consulting an occupational therapist, for example, and reach out to your administrator if there are materials that are needed. And consider the need for protective gear as appropriate for individual student needs.
Other proactive strategies to consider are reinforcement and pairing. Pairing is the process of building a relationship with a student. As teachers, we do this all the time. It just looks different for students with disabilities. With students being out of the building for a year, we may need to implement a pairing process to establish new routines and establish staff as a reinforcing presence. In the context of everything going on right now, why are we focusing on pairing? Pairing and reinforcement are important because if we can establish ourselves as a reinforcing presence, then it's likely to reduce problem behavior.
Now we are going to show two videos that define and demonstrate reinforcement and pairing. Note, while these videos may refer to therapists, clients, autism, or a clinical application, pairing can and should be implemented in a classroom setting with school staff or students who may exhibit problem behaviors. As we watch the first video on reinforcement, think about some examples and how you could provide reinforcement during our COVID situation.
In this video, we will define and give some examples of different types of reinforcers. We will explain why we use reinforcers and provide some key points on how to use them to maximize their effectiveness. A reinforcer is anything contingent on a behavior that increases the likelihood of a behavior recurring. Simply put, reinforcers are rewards that we use to signal to a child that he or she has responded correctly and to encourage the child to respond the same way again. Reinforcers provide motivation and essential feedback to the child and strengthen learned responses. There are an endless variety of ways that you can reinforce a child. Here is a list of a few options. The most basic type of reinforcer that you can use is food or drink. If you give a child a piece of a desired food or a sip of a favorite beverage after responding correctly to a task, the child will be more likely to respond the same way again. Food or drink can be excellent reinforcers, especially at the beginning of therapy when you are still determining what the child might find rewarding. Other reinforcers include favorite toys, physical touch, and activities such as tickles, bouncy knee rides, or hugs as rewards for correct responses. If the child enjoys these things, they can be wonderful reinforcers. Another useful reinforcer is task avoidance. Ending the task at hand can be very rewarding for many children. Removing the teaching materials from the table, throwing away quiz cards as they are finished, or allowing the child to get up and leave can be very potent reinforcers.
Do this.
Marvelous! Do this.
Do this.
That's right, Corey! Do this.
Do this.
Wonderful! Do this.
Do this.
Amazing! Let's go play!
Another important type of reinforcer is verbal praise. Verbal praise is a bit different from the reinforcers mentioned so far because most children with autism will likely be indifferent to verbal praise at first. However, verbal praise is very commonly used in our society today. Therefore, it is important to teach children with autism to learn how to enjoy it. To accomplish this, we must always include verbal praise with the other types of rewards that we use.
Touch shoe. Oh, way to go. I love how hard you're working. Good work. I've got more crackers.
By consistently pairing verbal praise with other rewards, such as food, toys, or physical touch, the children will slowly learn to enjoy it. The last types of reinforcers that we will discuss are counters and token systems. When counters or tokens are used, the child earns tokens or points that can be exchanged for rewards. Here is an example of a counter in which the child must earn all the pieces of a puzzle in order to get the end reward.
What do you want? So, alrighty.
Oh, why? Oh, why?
Look, we're gonna get all the cars.
Yeah.
Then, cookie. Yay! Shoes. Oh, here it comes. Put it on. There, you got one. Wow.
One more.
Shoes. Here, let me put it on for you. There it goes. Boink. Shoes. Wonderful. Do, 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 do. There you go. Shoes. Boink, boink, bloop.
I'll pull it on this one.
Shoes. Boink. You need one more, then you get cookie. Shoes. Here it goes. Boink. Look, you got all your cars. Time for cookie. Yummy, 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 yummy.
Counters and tokens tend to be used when children are slightly more advanced in their treatment programs. They allow us to teach children to work for short periods of time without receiving a concrete reward. Many different kinds of counters can be generated, and we can vary the number of responses needed to get the end reward.
Clap hands.
Now that we have explained what reinforcers are, let's talk about why we use them.
There it goes.
One reason we use reinforcement is to provide feedback about the correctness of a response. Because children with autism have difficulty processing language, we must rely on reinforcers to let children know when they have responded in the way that we want.
Fox.
The second reason we use reinforcement is to motivate the child to learn. Our goal is to make therapy so reinforcing that the child looks forward to this time of day as the time of day when great things happen. There are several key points to keep in mind in order to maximize the effectiveness of reinforcement. If a child gives the correct response, we must deliver the reinforcement immediately. The therapist must be enthusiastic and involved, and the reinforcement must be varied. These components ensure that we reinforce the target behavior. The reinforcement must be immediate because if reinforcement is delayed, we might inadvertently reinforce something the child does after the target behavior. By reinforcing immediately, we let the child know clearly which response was correct. Reinforcement is also more effective if we involve ourselves in whatever type of reinforcement we are using. Make the play fun. For example, if we are giving a child a piece of food, instead of just placing it on the table for the child, we can fly it to the child like an airplane.
Chips. Oh, wow, that was great. Yummy.
This way, we become reinforcers for the child.
Marvelous, Corey. Which one? Awesome.
The last point is to ensure that reinforcement is varied. Varying reinforcement means two things. First, we must constantly change reinforcers. Second, we must vary the intensity of reinforcement depending on how the child responds. Constantly changing a reinforcer means that a reinforcer should not be used more than twice in a row before another reinforcer is substituted. If a child is given the same reinforcer repeatedly, the child will get bored with it and no longer find it rewarding. This is called satiation, and it can greatly slow down the progress of a child. Varying the intensity of reinforcement is called differential reinforcement. Differential reinforcement means that the child will receive a more preferred reward for better effort or a well-executed response. By saving the best reinforcers for the child's biggest efforts, we encourage the child to put forth a maximum effort. Now that we have defined reinforcers and talked about how to use them, we need to discuss how to develop new reinforcers. We must be constantly searching for new and effective reinforcers in order to vary them and avoid satiation. One way to develop new reinforcers is to observe what the child enjoys doing during free play. Favorite toys can be reserved for use in therapy or used as rewards after therapy. If the child likes television, he or she could earn tokens towards watching 5 minutes of television. Another way of finding new reinforcers is to modify a child's existing self-stimulatory behaviors. Gazing at a light, arm flapping, spinning, and lining things up in rows are all common self-stimulatory behaviors. It is often possible to modify these behaviors so that they are non-disruptive and more socially acceptable. For example, if a child likes to gaze at lights, you could teach the child to enjoy playing with a kaleidoscope and then use that toy as a reward. Finally, you can test for new reinforcers using a reinforcement survey. To do this, present the child with a choice of 2 potential reinforcers and keep track of which one the child chooses. Once you find a reinforcer that works to motivate the child, you should not allow the child to play with it outside of therapy. And within therapy, you should limit the time that the child has access to the reinforcer to about 10 to 20 seconds each time it is used. By reserving reinforcers for therapy, you increase the chances that the child will remain interested in them and motivated to learn. So far in this video, we have defined reinforcement and given some examples of different types of reinforcers. We explained why we use reinforcers and provided some examples of how to use them to maximize their effectiveness. We also discussed ways to develop reinforcers that are the most effective for each child. I hope that you have found today's training video useful, and I would like to wish you the best of luck.
So while watching that video, you may have considered some ideas that we typically use in our classrooms, such as verbal praise, thumb dojo points, token boards, or access to videos. Now we're going to watch a video on pairing. While watching, think of possible ways that we can pair given our COVID reality.
Hi everyone! Now I want to talk to you guys about one of the most important teaching procedures in an ABA program. That's called pairing and building instructional control. Pairing is essentially the process by which we establish ourselves as really reinforcing people. What we want our kids to know is when we walk into a room, we're paired with fun events, that we're not paired with work or demands. Another really important part that comes with pairing is building instructional control. And what essentially that means is we want to be the most fun person in the room for our kids while also being the person that stays consistent across all areas of learning. Pairing ourselves as reinforcers and establishing instructional control are 2 of the most important teaching procedures in an ABA program. Basically, we want to be the most effective teachers for our kids, and that also includes parents.
During that video, you may have considered delivering a favorite item or activity at the student's desk or work area. You may have thought about watching videos with the student and getting excited about them with the student, and talking to students about areas of interest.
Again, pairing is the process by which you connect yourself with all of the learner's favorite items and activities. Through these repeated connections, you take on the value of all the good stuff and become the ultimate reinforcer. Everyone should be having fun, both the staff and the students. Many do this already without even realizing it. Staff form relationships with students by showing interest in things the student likes, pairing themselves with those items and the student. They then become naturally reinforcing to the student. You might wonder why a student always wants to work with one adult over another, or why they respond to one staff more often. It's due to pairing.
How to pair. How to pair. It's important to know the student and what do they like. It's important to allow them access to their preferred items, toys, videos, attention, etc. It's important to engage in parallel play with the student and enjoy yourself. It's important while you're doing this to make comments, but not questions or demands. Think about saying something like, "I love this video," instead of saying something like, "Tell me what happened during the beginning, the middle, or the end of the story." Remember when pairing that these reinforcers are only available with you. The student can move away from you, but the reinforcers stay with you in the workspace. And the process of pairing truly never ends. Continue to spend time each day pairing with your students.
Golden rule for pairing: you control the reinforcers. You'll continue to allow access to the reinforcers, but you add an easy demand first. You begin with the student requesting an item and then gradually increase the demand until the student is completing their work to earn reinforcers.
Now we're going to watch another video about the process of pairing. And again, although this setting may not be a classroom setting, think about how this might apply in your setting, your classroom.
Hello, my name is Philippe Saladin. I'm the training coordinator here at the West Lafayette facility. In this video, we're going to be talking about pairing and how it's used to develop a relationship with the client and pair ourselves with reinforcing activities so that we become reinforcing ourselves. Pairing involves associating yourself with reinforcing items so that you become the giver of all good things. The way that we do this is by seeing what the client likes, following their motivation, and giving those things to them non-contingently, without any demands placed on the client. As we go along, we'll introduce them to new items and activities so that we have a wide range of things to pull from, so that we're not satiating the client on just a few things that they like, and we have a bunch of things that we can pair ourselves with. Pairing is key to creating a productive teaching environment. Pairing results in the child being more likely to want to please their therapist and do well. It sets the stage for effective work sessions by establishing instructional control, which involves a positive working relationship. Follow the child's motivation, but also introduce them to new activities or items that they might like. Pair yourself with the items and activities that the child loves. Get involved. Don't just sit by and watch. While you are pairing, place very limited demands on the child. Examples of this would be no, wait, stop, or can I see that? Even simple things like, hey, look at me, are demands and need to be limited. Pairing involves both capturing and contriving motivation. So capturing would involve seeing that the client wants something, them telling you that they want to go jump on the trampoline, pointing to a glass of water. While contriving MOs involves creating an activity that you think may be motivating to the client. An example of this would be going to the motorhome and jumping on the trampoline, and you yourself doing flips and jumps to make it more motivating for them to jump on it themselves. You know you're well paired when the client is attending to you, following simple demands, has minimal problem behavior, it's not totally gone, but it's less than what it was before, and they're requesting items from you and following you versus you having to follow them around. Let's talk about some pairing tips and tricks. Make sure to follow the client's motivation and take them around the center to see what they gravitate towards. As they are playing, make mental notes of similar but new activities to introduce them to. Do not assume that you know what your client likes. You should be open to exploring fun activities with them. If it's something that you personally don't like, make sure that that doesn't come across on your face. Remember, it's about the client. Your client's motivation will change. It's important to constantly be monitoring this. In addition, Cornerstone staff will routinely administer preference assessments to assess the client's current highest reinforcers. Make sure to get involved. Play side by side with them and narrate their play as they go through the center. As they do exhibit appropriate behavior, make sure to reinforce this with a lot of praise and reinforcement. Here's an example of pairing in therapy. You know that your client loves trains, so you take him to the train room and get overly excited about the trains. You start to play with him, narrate his play. You begin to make all the train sounds that you know of as you play with him. Once you have transitioned to a different room, The client then pulls you towards the train room. He is beginning to pair you with the trains. As we're wrapping up, make sure to have fun. Be that giver of all good things, not the taker. If you want the client to ask something from you, make sure that you're playing side by side with them versus taking it away. Have fun, guys, and enjoy the pairing process.
As you can see, pairing is a process, and it will last different lengths of time for each student and possibly for each adult working with that student.
Preparing for pairing. In order to be prepared, it's important that you have either our students or families complete a reinforcement inventory. This allows us to gather a large repertoire of things that are interesting to our students and have them readily available as they return to school. Stage 1, remember, no demands, free access to activities. Stage 2, make a choice. Request for preferred activities. Stage 3, ask for more of an activity or an item. And stage 4, tolerate staff interacting with materials alongside with the student. As you're gathering materials in preparation for returning to school, remember, parents can send in reinforcers and items for school. To keep things safe, they should be kept in an identified location and not shared with other students.
Reinforcement. When we talk about reinforcement, we're talking about an item or access to something that is given after a behavior to increase the likelihood that that behavior is going to happen again. The reinforcer is something that your child will work for. Reinforcement comes after a positive behavior. We give a reinforcer to help increase the chance of a positive behavior happening again and again. Although we want our students to have reinforcers that are age appropriate, it is sometimes possible that a student is interested or prefers items or activities that are for much younger students. And that's okay, especially if this is the only item or activity that works for the student. There may be times that we need to be flexible and use items that are not age appropriate because they may be the strongest reinforcer for right now.
Remember, we cannot reinforce too much. We want to make sure that we incorporate a variety of rewards and choices for our students. And make requesting easy for our students. This isn't the time to train or shape behaviors or sentence structure or the use of a device. Every student should have their own individualized reinforcement system and schedule, and we want to reinforce high probability behaviors.
We may need to revisit previous reinforcement strategies, schedules, and systems. Consider moving back a level in terms of reinforcement systems. For example, maybe a student had a token board or a contract that was previously faded. We may need to reintroduce them. Maybe the student was up to a point of working for 10 tokens or 10 points. We may need to go back to 5. Maybe the student was just able to work on a token board. We may need to revisit a first then strategy. Consider the reinforcement schedule, the length of breaks from demands. And again, we're always going to err on the side of reinforcing too much. Remember, our students have been out of school for about a year. They have likely regressed in terms of their demand tolerance. These students we have in our classrooms are not the same student that they were when they left us. It is important to be flexible, at least at first. We can always and should always be working back to where they were, but we may need to start at a different starting point. When we say a reinforcement schedule, that's just a predetermined schedule of reinforcement for the student. We should always be thinking about how often we can and should be reinforcing that student. Be proactive with reinforcement. We should not be waiting until behaviors occur. And if we do have a student on a reinforcement schedule, that needs to be planned and followed.
Let's talk about differential reinforcement. Differential reinforcement is an approach where the staff choose to provide immediate reinforcement when a student is exhibiting a desired behavior, such as following classroom rules and routines, staying in their seats, or most importantly, wearing their face masks. Think about catching a student being good and providing increased reinforcement when the student is showing desired behaviors.
Another type of reinforcement is known as non-contingent reinforcement. This is when the teacher delivers ongoing brief reinforcement to a student independent of the student's behavior. This reinforcement is provided to the student so that problem behavior becomes unnecessary. We typically deliver non-contingent reinforcement on some sort of schedule. The example here being a timer, and when the timer goes off, that student is getting that reinforcement. And this reinforcement is always used in conjunction with pairing.
When do we use non-contingent reinforcement? It's most effective when the function of a behavior is to gain attention. It doesn't teach or reinforce alternative behaviors. It should be used with other behavioral strategies that teach appropriate behavioral skills. It should be used anytime the teacher can deliver brief reinforcement to the student during instruction. It's important to note that a schedule is used when delivering non-contingent reinforcement. Some examples are breaks, access to certain items at specific times, attention on a set schedule. Non-contingent reinforcement should also be used during the pairing process.
Now we're going to talk about some additional proactive behavior strategies. The first strategy we're going to talk about is demand fading, or reducing task demands. Across the day, think about slowly increasing demands to earn reinforcement. We want to incorporate classroom daily schedules from day one. We want to run our small group, for example, but we want to start with low demands. If students begin exhibiting problem behavior, we want to think about fading the demand and introduce and increase reinforcement slowly. Staff should be delivering positive attention for students across the day. Remember, this is where the idea of non-contingent reinforcement and pairing will really pay off. Demand fading happens naturally during the process of pairing.
Let's take a look at a video that's an example of demand fading. This was an example of using the strategy demand fading to increase work output and on-task behavior.
So now what? We've paired ourselves with reinforcement. We have faded our demands, but now we really need to teach. What are we going to do when behaviors do arise?
Behaviors, proactive and responsive strategy. The goal of these next slides is to help our teams and teachers think about COVID-safe strategies that can be used to address the behaviors that our students may exhibit. In light of COVID, we need to be thinking about alternative ways to manage behaviors that lower the risk of escalation and lower the chance of physical intervention will be needed. There's no magic bullet. There are things that still may happen, but we want to do everything possible to reduce those situations. There is no way that one training can cover every eventuality. So much varies given the profile of our students. What is ideal for a kindergarten age student may not work for an older student. These next slides will contain starting points for new strategies. At your classroom team and team levels, along with your support staff, you'll need to create individual plans for your students.
One behavior that we may come across that will be new to us in our time of COVID is what to do if a student is not wearing a mask. We want to first think about some proactive strategies to address students who are not wearing masks. We want to think about systematic instruction and tolerance training. Think about practicing with students now while you still are teaching them virtually. Think about working on a timer with students to increase their time that they will keep their mask on. Think about giving students access to individualized mask breaks upon request or scheduled, maybe a time where you could take them away from other students and allow them to have a certain amount of time without their mask. Think about where the student may be seated. Think about if there's a seating arrangement that you can place that student in that will give them access to ventilation, facing a wall or a divider to reduce the access they have to other staff and students if they are having trouble wearing a mask. It will be important for us to pair our most valuable reinforcers with mask wearing to encourage that behavior. Within the classroom, we can use dividers, social distancing, and individualized materials to reduce any other contact on germ sharing. And it may be important to think about using differential reinforcement for mask wearing. Some other things you may want to do are consider a class-wide behavior program like a marble jar for mask wearing.
For students not wearing masks, some responsive strategies would be ongoing instruction and training, reconsidering our environmental factors or barriers, direct correlation for when not wearing a mask, and differentiated reinforcements for students who are wearing masks. We want to make sure that we're complementing and reinforcing students who are wearing their masks. Work with the family to identify or practice wearing masks at home and be sure to include reinforcement. Also, work with the family to identify strong reinforcers and rotate regularly. It's important to note that mask wearing should be considered an educational need for training and practice. It's not considered a behavior that requires disciplinary action.
Now we're going to think about what we may need to do for a student who is having trouble staying in their seat or in their assigned location. Some proactive strategies we can do to help the student remain in their seat are giving non-contingent and differential reinforcement to the student to encourage staying in their seat. We need to give this student access to frequent movement breaks or communication training in order for them to request breaks. We might need to be giving frequent reinforcer assessments and opportunities to request items that your child may be trying to access when they're getting out of their seat. So think about, why is the student getting out of their seat, and try to give them access to the items that they may be getting to, or the people they may be trying to get to. We may need to look at alternate seating, like a wobble cushion, a rocking chair, a yoga ball, a TheraBand, bike pedals. You may also want to give the student the opportunity to stand at their desk, still in their assigned location. And think about preferential seating again. Think about, where could this student be in the room that is not distracting and not dangerous to other students. We may want to think about giving students rule reminders and visual cues on their desk to remind them of the expectations. We're going to use things in our classrooms to create visuals like tape, feet, and labels so that the students know where they are allowed to be. We also might want to think about assigning certain students to certain staff so that staff can help monitor the students in the room.
Responding strategies for out-of-seat behavior. For some students, we may need to hold a room divider in front of the student to promote social distancing. It's also really important that our students have the opportunity to practice making requests for things like movement breaks or desired items. Many times we assume that our students have the language, or they know what the name or the label of the item is that they're getting out of their seat to get. Sometimes they need to be able to have a different time of day to be able to practice making requests. We also want to make sure that we're redirecting students back to their seat and reinforcing them for when they are engaging in the desired behavior.
The next behavior we're going to think about is elopement, or those times where the student is leaving their designated area, especially a student who may have a risk of leaving the classroom or even the building. So for proactive strategies, again, we want to think about reinforcement. So we want to think about what sort of reinforcement can we make available to the student for absence of the elopement behavior. So staying in their designated location or seat or classroom for a certain period of time. With students who have demonstrated elopement in the past, it's very important to think about proximity. Where's the best place in the classroom for this student to sit or be assigned? And then where is the best place for staff to be positioned if we start to see that this behavior might happen? It's important to give students frequent movement breaks. And it's important to help them practice requesting those movement breaks in an appropriate way instead of eloping from the assigned area. And with elopement, we really need to think about safety first, right? This is a safety concern, and we want to think about how we are going to prepare ourselves for this behavior.
Again, for students who have eloping behavior, it is a safety concern first. So we would still need to run after a student if they are in danger. If this occurs, we want to make sure that we consider the highest level of PPE with these students before the behavior occurs. Remember, call for team support, visually monitor the student on or off site. Safety first.
Now we're going to talk about some of the attention-seeking behaviors our students sometimes engage in. These behaviors could be laughing, being silly, or being off task, but it can look a lot of different ways in our classroom. So some proactive strategies for attention-seeking behaviors are going to be creating visuals and rule reminders to the students. So emphasizing the behavior that we're looking for. What does on-task behavior look like in your classroom? Providing a high level of reinforcement for engaging in these appropriate behaviors. Really planned ignoring for low-level behaviors. So really think to yourself, how intrusive is this behavior to instruction? considering safety, and considering everything that's going into our classrooms right now. Think about the room setup and where this student might be best seated. If the behavior is attention seeking, they might need less ability to see the other students, or they may need to be further away from the teacher, for example, just depending on the student's needs. If you have students with compulsive behavior, these same strategies can be helpful with it when addressing those behaviors, such as closing a door, turning the lights on and off repeatedly, stepping in certain places, touching a specific number, etc.
When we're responding to attention-seeking behaviors, again, we need to decide how intrusive the behavior is to instruction and when to consider planned ignoring. We're going to take a minute to watch a video on how to implement planned ignoring.
Hello, didn't see you there. In our first video, we will be demonstrating how to help students overcome negative behaviors using positive reinforcement.
Morning! Who's ready for Miss Brianna's classroom? Hi, Craig. Good to see you. Hi. All right. How about everybody come and sit down so we can get ready to learn? Thanks for sitting down, Craig. That's awesome. I think someone's motivated. Wow, Alexa. Thanks for sitting down so quietly. This is awesome. Who's ready to learn now? Yes, guys? Craig?
Yay, we're ready to learn.
In this next clip, we will be demonstrating planned ignoring, followed by positive reinforcement, once the child shows the positive behavior.
Today we'll be working on our multiplication skills. We'll start with 828 multiplied by 2. Does anyone know what 8 times 2 is?
16.
Jenna. 16, wonderful. 2 times 2? 4. 4 plus 1? 5. That's great. And what about 8 times 2 again?
16.
Awesome.
What are you doing?
Thanks for trying, Craig. Shows a lot of initiative.
Thanks.
You're welcome. In this next clip, we will showcase another example of planned ignoring in conjunction with positive reinforcement. 2, 1.
All right, we'll start our activity as soon as everyone's sitting up. Crisscross applesauce, nice and silent. Brianna, that's looking great. Thanks for sitting quietly. Thank you, Jenna. We'll get started now. So we have a bunch of fruit and vegetables here, different colors. What I'm going to do is throw them all out, and I want to see how fast you can collect them all and put them back in the right label, okay? When I say go. And go. Good job, Brianna. Good effort. Yeah, that's orange. Good job. Excellent. Oh, Jenna, nice. Green and green. Good job.
Go.
Hello. In our last clip, you're going to see an example of positive reinforcement used as a daily routine in your classroom.
All right, everyone. It is nearing the end of the school day, so I would like you to please clean up quietly and effectively. You can go ahead. Excellent effort, Brianna and Alexa. Excellent work, you guys. Perfect. Because you guys did such an amazing job today, you get one more star. That makes 10, and you know what that means. Gummies! Yay!
Notice they used planned ignoring for low-level behaviors. It's important to note that if a student is engaging in an unsafe behavior, we would need to address it carefully and safely.
Another behavior or skill we might want to think about is teaching our students about self-regulation. When our students become unregulated or are having difficulty with this skill, sometimes they may be engaging in self-stim behaviors or maybe just some impulsivity. So some things that we might work on with our students to encourage self-regulation is using the resources, for example, a resource like Zones of Regulation, to help the student understand and communicate about how they're feeling. Helping students identify their zones regularly, doing this both instructionally and sort of responsively, is really important. It's important to have the student be part of the experience and part of the conversation of identifying different strategies that work for them for each of these zones. And then having the students be able to practice the strategies for each zone so that then when they find themselves, for example, in zone red, that they're able to engage in that strategy. It might be important to give our students access to sensory items or sensory play and scheduled motor breaks as well.
Many of our students demonstrate rigid behavior and inflexibility. Several other proactive strategies are things like those structured routines, lots of reinforcement, visual supports that help identify what the expectations are, use of planned ignoring for low-level behaviors, modeling and building in flexibility when possible within the routines and schedules, transition cues, and providing instruction in cognitive flexibility using resources like Unstuck and On Target if it's appropriate and the student has the ability, the cognitive ability to be able to understand the concepts in those resources.
Some responsive strategies for rigid behavior are to allow the behavior if it is not dangerous, to redirect the student or engage the student in verbal problem solving as they are able and capable, offering controlled choices to the student, and again, providing some differential reinforcement.
Many of us have students who throw tantrums throughout the school day. There are proactive strategies that we can use to avoid tantrum behavior. Non-contingent reinforcement, planned ignoring of those low-level behaviors, visual cues to remind students of appropriate behaviors, differential reinforcement, and limiting demands that trigger these behaviors. Pay close attention to antecedent awareness. What are those behaviors that happen before the student engages in tantrum behavior? That is where we want to make sure that we intervene to be proactive against a student having a tantrum.
If a student is having a tantrum, some responsive strategies we can engage are to allow the tantrum as appropriate, wait until the student is calm, and clearing the space if needed, clearing the space of items and or people. It would be important during a tantrum situation for staff to consider their use of PPE, and this would be an appropriate time to use our enhanced PPE to help increase the protection of the staff. And it would be important during a tantrum to remember to reduce our verbal demands to the student and using visual cues as much as possible to redirect that student and reminding them of the behavior we want them to engage in.
If a student's behavior escalates to the point where they are beginning to demonstrate aggressive behavior, here are some proactive strategies. We want to consider the environment. Where is the student seated? Is there enough spacing between the students and the staff? Are we providing non-contingent reinforcement? We can redirect using our adult body as proximity. Again, using those visual cues as reminders of the appropriate behavior to show the student what to do. Differential reinforcement and limiting the demands that trigger the behavior. Again, with the antecedent awareness, we want to make sure that we are intervening before the student escalates to the point of engaging in aggressive behaviors. There are some behaviors that we can ignore to an extent, but we have to make sure that we maintain safety at all costs. If it's maintained by attention from others, that is an aggressive behavior that we might be able to ignore, and it may go away quicker. If a behavior is difficult to ignore, then you'll want to engage in proactive and reactive strategies.
When thinking about aggressive behavior, some things that we will need to do to be responsive to this behavior would be to engage our CPI training, our personal safety awareness, and our disengagement skills. It's important that when a student is showing aggressive behavior, to block and move away from the student. Think about using things such as blocker pads or other items you might have available in your classroom to protect staff and other students from this student. It's important to move away, create space between you and the student and others and the student. It would be very important in this situation to clear the space, keeping the other students in the classroom safe, and call for support as needed. And this is something you want to communicate with your team about before it happens. So have a plan in place of where we may be able to take other students, for example. Have a plan in place for who in the building is able to respond to help in this situation.
We talked earlier in this presentation about how we would have to adjust the way that we interact with our students around prompting. When we think about the guidance regarding prompt levels, we want to make sure that staff are wearing masks and washing hands in between working with the students. When providing instructional support, you want to consider where you're positioning yourself. You may want to sit on the side or behind a student without restricting free movement for the student. You want to continue to use a prompt hierarchy, but use less restrictive prompts, first working your way up to the proper PPE as needed. Staff should limit physical support as much as possible. For example, instead of holding a student's hand, staff can provide support at the forearm, elbow, or under the arm, or place a guided hand on the student's lower back. Remember, PPE will be important. Please make sure that you participate in the PPE training to determine what level is best for you in your job. As a team, discuss the use of gloves. It's a lot safer to wash your hands than it is to wear gloves and risk cross-contamination. Examples of appropriate times to wear gloves: think about universal precautions during toileting, during eating, and appropriate times to wear gloves.
Some alternatives for physical prompting include step-by-step model prompting. So think about modeling discrete steps for a task that your student may need to complete, such as getting unpacked in the morning, take off backpack, then the student takes off the backpack. Staff puts the backpack on a hook, the student copies, etc., etc. Video modeling, either recording one step at a time or the total task. Student can either view this video before the task or while they're completing the task. Consider building in pauses to the video to allow the student to follow each step. We may want to think about adding more detail to visual schedules to break the tasks down further for students, to use more detailed photos in order to be able to reduce the need for physical prompting. It is very important to use visual cues on materials, stickers, bright colors, arrows, to show the student where to start, where they are, where they may be finishing. We can use things in our classroom, such as laser pointers, pens, flashlights, in order to highlight items during instruction without becoming close to a student. And think about position prompting. As an initial teaching strategy, place the correct flashcard closer to the student during each trial, or an equivalent being a Google slide. So maybe increasing the chance that the student will get the question correct the first time in order to be able to reduce our physical proximity or the need for a physical prompt to our student to correct them.
Instructional considerations. Consider grouping students based on their ability to work independently or to sit for longer periods of time. You may want to also look at learner levels or common skills. Consider continued use of Chromebooks during the school day for individual instruction and using resources such as Boom Cards or Nearpod, where the students are already familiar with the use of these resources.
How can I adapt? When thinking about independent work and materials that we are providing for our students, it may be important to have individual bins for student materials. It may be important to have a student use the same materials for a week and then rotate the next week having access to different materials. Continue the use of Chromebooks for learning, especially using the one-to-one Chromebook assignment. Think about the packing and unpacking routines of your students. How can we use student-specific spaces versus how our lockers and cubbies grouped together? Just think about the entirety of the school day and where we may need to do things slightly differently than we have in the past.
What's next? It's important to go back to your school teams and discuss the things that we've talked about throughout this training. Make a plan and be specific with your students. You want to make sure that you're being consistent. Be on the same page with your colleagues and continue to communicate with each other. You're going to have to make adjustments as we transition back to school, so that will require increased communication.
Now we have a glossary of some of the frequent terms that we used throughout today's training, just in an effort to revisit some of the key points and some terms that we may have used frequently. So differential reinforcement, again, is that approach where staff choose to provide immediate reinforcement when a student is exhibiting the desired behavior. Remember, here we are focusing on the behavior we want, not the behavior we want to avoid. When we talk about demand fading, we are talking about the idea of decreasing an individual's challenging behavior maintained by escape from demands. Demands are then initially removed. Then, as the challenging behavior remains low, demands are gradually reintroduced. The idea of extinction is not one we talked a lot about today, because that's the idea of when a reinforcement for a behavior is able to be discontinued. For instance, attention is no longer given to a student who is hitting his desk for attention. Sometimes we think about really focusing on some behaviors or targeting them because we want that behavior to become extinct. Right now, in our situation with COVID, we want to think about behaviors differently because we really want to think about which things do we need to target and which things can we ignore.
Planned ignoring. The procedure of planned ignoring means deliberately inattention to the occurrence of a target child's behavior. In other words, the teacher identifies behaviors that function as a means of getting their attention and selectively ignoring them. How to request may need to be taught if the team elects to use planned ignoring procedures. Prompting are the cues that we use to assist with providing to a student to assist with performing a specific skill or behavior. Prompts can be verbal, gestural, model, physical, or visual. For more information, you can find resources on our Canvas site for prompting and prompt sequences and cues.
And lastly, non-contingent reinforcement is when we reward students non-contingently or regardless of their behavior. This is usually done on a set schedule, and some examples of this include scheduled attention. Student gets attention or specific praise every 5 minutes, regardless of what they are doing. Scheduled rewards is student gets access to a preferred item every 5 minutes, regardless of their behavior. The rationale for this is if the student gets reinforced more frequently, they do not need to engage in undesirable behavior to get their reinforcers.
Thank you so much for joining us for addressing challenging behaviors.